Hi, everyone. Hello, welcome. We're going to give folks a moment to land in this space, but we are so glad you are here. For those of you who are in the room, I'd love to know where you're from. So whether that's geographically, school, or chime in the chat. We'll get the chat going. But I'm Evelyn Moon. I'm the Director of Learning and Content Strategy here at Good Grief. And I just want to start from a place of gratitude. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to spend some time with you today. And no worries, we can't see you. This is webinar style, so it's just us, so you don't have to worry about the recording. So this is being recorded. It will be available later on YouTube. We will share the link with everyone who's registered. But again, just a place of gratitude. I know we're all pulled in a million different ways, and you taking the time to watch this with us, whether it's live or on YouTube later, is just such an honor. So today's session is part of our Good Grief community webinar series. Every school year from September through June, we bring you experts, information, resources. We really want to extend the work that we're doing outside of our centers and into this virtual space. So friends who are here live, you will be hearing from me again within the next 48 hours. You will get a certificate of attendance. Sorry, YouTube friends, if you're watching this asynchronously, no certificate, but we still appreciate you and we're glad that you're here and watching. So just a little bit about Good Grief in case we've got any newbies in the space. Good Grief is a nonprofit organization. We've been in New Jersey since 2004, and our mission is to build resilience in children, strengthen families, and empower communities to grow from loss and adversity. And like I said, in recent years, our work has been growing outside of our centers, where we provide completely free and unlimited peer support programming to grieving children and their families, but also extending into schools, hospitals, healthcare, funeral industry. And we're also expanding into partnerships like the one that you'll see today with universities. So this is just big picture, the work that we do, the work in our centers, our partnerships with schools. Every spring, we do a Spring Institute. So this past March at the Pingree School, we focused on grief and addiction. We partnered with What's Your Grief, who did a great presentation, and also Dr. Kenneth Doka as our keynote. So we're looking forward to next year. So mark your calendars for mid-March 2024. We also do professional development and training, parent and caregiver education, youth and funerals initiative, and then this webinar series. So you're already here. So at this point, enough about me, enough about Good Grief. I want to hand things over to our presenters. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I will be here if you need any support. Take it away.
Yeah, that looks great. Thank you. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. It's very exciting to have so many participants here, and today we're going to be presenting on cultural considerations in grief support. We are all first-year doctoral students at the Seton Hall University Counseling Psychology program. My name is Nicole Yukin. I go by she, her, hers pronouns, and currently my research interests are in bicultural identity and help-seeking attitudes among immigrants in the United States.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Angela Cabell. My pronouns are she and her. My research interest is disparities in mental health services for post-incarcerated individuals from marginalized populations. So welcome.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ramona. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and my research and clinical interests are working with Muslim American youth and families, and also racial trauma. So we would love for you, to get to know you guys a little better. So if you could just answer this poll so we know exactly like who our participants are, that'd be amazing.
I'm just watching all the numbers move up and down. All right, it looks like it's slowing down a little bit. who is in the room. Okay. I'm going to end the poll. Thank you to everyone who participated.
Oh, that's a good mix, I guess. I like it. It's good to know that most of you guys are students similar to us. So we hope this is applicable to everyone and you guys enjoy this entire, presentation.
So today we're going to start out by reviewing some of the learning objectives of the presentation. We're going to go over the DSM diagnostic criteria for prolonged grief and some of its limitations in our opinion. We're going to define and discuss cultural competency, humility, and cultural sensitivity. We're going to talk about some examples of grief in different cultures. And we're not going to be able to cover all cultures, and even for the ones we do cover, it's not going to be generalizable to everyone who identifies as part of that culture. And we're also going to talk about the role of culturally sensitive mental health providers. So we hope that you walk away from this presentation with an understanding of the role of intersectional identities in grief and mourning, an understanding of the role of cultural competency, cultural humility, and cultural sensitivity in working with people or just speaking with people experiencing grief, and to gain some insight into our own biases surrounding grief. So just to get a sense of where you all stand on this topic right now, we have another poll for you. So do you think that culture influences the grieving process? And so you can select yes, no, or maybe, and we can see where everyone is at in the room.
All right, looking good. Got about 80% of the room that has participated. Just give you all one more moment to click yes, no, maybe so. All right.
Great. So it looks like most people do indeed think that culture influences the grieving process. Some people said maybe, not a single no. So for those of you who said yes or maybe, what are some ways that culture influences grief? And you can just feel free to throw this into the chat. Right, so I'm seeing some answers start to pop in. I see how we respond to death is different across culture, family, tradition, the amount of time spent grieving, specific rituals, what resources we seek out, different stigma, religions, expectations. So all of these definitely are pieces that we hope to touch on throughout this presentation, and we also hope to expand these ideas as well.
Okay, so let's get into it. So what is grief and bereavement in the DSM? The DSM, for anyone that might not know, stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. We're currently at the 5th edition text revision. So what bereavement is the experience of losing a loved one to death. There's a distinction between grief and major depressive episode. So a bereaved person with grief often experiences a mixture of sadness and more pleasant emotions as they remember the deceased. Their experience, which is a very understandable, thing that they're going through, they might be going through anguish and pain, which is usually experienced in waves or pangs rather than continuously, which is usually the case in major depression. Also, typically, the grieving person maintains the hope that things will get better, but an individual who's clinically depressed has a mood that's almost uniformly one of gloom, despair, and hopelessness. And that's usually all day and every day. And unlike the typical bereaved person, the individual with major depression is usually impaired in like daily functioning. Also, another thing that differentiates grief and major depressive disorder would be the self-esteem. In a grieving person, it usually stays intact, but in major depression, it'll, the feelings of worthlessness, self-loathing are very common. Dysphoric mood in grief is likely to decrease in intensity over days to weeks, and they, as I said, occur in waves or pangs with thoughts of the person who died, whereas the depressed mood in major depressive episode is more persistent. So like, why is it important to distinguish between the two? Because in the previous DSM, so DSM-4, clinicians were not able to diagnose major depressive disorder after a recent death. Clinicians, unless they were suicidal, psychotic, or severely impaired, but that changed in the DSM-5 because many researchers and clinicians didn't think that that was fair, because it was very possible for someone who lost someone, close to them to have major depressive episode or even major depressive disorder. So now clinicians can diagnose individuals with major depressive disorder for someone who is grieving. In addition, the DSM-5 also added prolonged grief disorder, and an individual with prolonged grief disorder may experience intense longing for the person who has died or preoccupation with the thoughts of that person. Additionally, the individual may experience significant distress or problems performing daily activities at home, work, or other important areas. Persistent grief is, disabling and affects everyday functioning in a way that typical grieving does not. So the symptoms include, first and foremost, the death has to be at least 12 months ago, and for children it would be 6 months ago. And since the development of persistent grief is characterized by one or both of the symptoms of intense yearning and longing, or preoccupation with thoughts or memories. And also you need 3 symptoms of either identity disruption, marked sense of disbelief about the death, avoidance of reminders, intense emotional pain, difficulty reintegrating into one's relationship and activities after the death, emotional numbness, feeling that life is meaningless, and intense loneliness. Also, it includes disturbances which are causing clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other areas of functioning. And a very major thing, which is really applicable to this presentation, is that the DSM-5, they made sure to write that the duration and severity of bereavement reaction clearly exceeded expected social, cultural, and religious norms for individuals in their culture and that context. And then the last one is that the grief isn't associated with any other, mental disorders, so such as major depressive disorder, PTSD, substance use, or any other medical conditions. So APA, American Psychiatric Associations, for the authors and publishers of DSM-5, stated that this diagnosis provides greater recognition to a mental health issue, and also, having prolonged grief disorder as something that is in there that you can diagnose, and would also allow more research, allow for better communication between psychologists or clinicians. Clinicians would be more knowledgeable of this. There's more access to help for clients, but also clinicians can get paid via insurance for this disorder now.
So based on this information about prolonged grief in the DSM, we would like to hear from you in the chat. What do you think about prolonged grief as a disorder, the pros and the cons? We would like to hear from you. Okay, so I'm seeing some responses in the chat that pathologizing a normal response could change one perception of themselves. It is good to have this condition diagnosable and treatable according to the DSM. I struggle with having grief become a psychiatric illness. Grief should not be labeled as a disorder, as it medicalizes a condition which is normal and natural. So some very good responses. Healing is linear, just like grief, a lifelong process. So these responses are very true. Grief is often pathologized. There's an assumption that everyone grieves the same, and a tendency to label grief reactions as normal and abnormal. And we have to take this to account. We have to take into account that the person that died, say for example, a person that lost a partner of 50 years, their grief response may be different from someone that may not have been married that long. And we also have to consider the circumstances surrounding the loss. If the loss was something that happened tragically and suddenly versus a long-term illness that the loss was expected. So these responses shows that people do experience grief in different ways. And the benefits of it, as Mamona mentioned, it being in the DSM, is that it does allow, if the person is diagnosed, insurance to cover the diagnosis. So the systems need to recognize it as recognize grief to make it a need for treatment valid. So very good responses, thank you. So what does it mean to be culturally competent? So a culturally competent system of care would acknowledge and incorporate at all levels the importance of culture, the assessment of cross-cultural relations, be vigilant towards the dynamic that result from cultural differences, expansion of cultural knowledge, and adapting of services to meet culturally unique needs. So whether you are a current medical provider, a future medical provider, part of an organization, such as working for Good Grief, it is important that you strive to become culturally competent. That means that you would consider the needs of all cultures, all different religions, peoples of different religions. And so we want to understand and integrate a person's values, beliefs, and behaviors about health and well-being. And we want to be able to provide quality care to every individual, no matter their race, ethnicity, and cultural background. And this can be applied to people who are grieving. This is extremely important because we want to make sure that we're providing culturally competent care individually and as an organization to address their needs. So being culturally competent is a process, and it occurs as a continuum. And this graph we see shows that it is a process. So cultural destructiveness is individual is characterized by attitudes that we may hold as individuals that can be destructive when working with various groups. Cultural incapacity is the lack of capacity to respond effectively to the needs and interests and preferences of culturally diverse groups who are grieving. Cultural blindness is viewing and treating all people the same when it comes to grief and how persons deal with it, and this approach is not helpful. So we don't want to be in those categories, but we want to go towards cultural pre-competence, where we have some awareness of growth so that we can effectively help diverse populations through grief. So we'll be exploring cultural issues. We're committed to assessing the needs of the person that we're working with. Cultural competence is when we recognize individual and cultural differences. So here the individual and the organization will be exemplifying cultural competence by recognizing individual and cultural differences in grief and seeking advice from diverse groups on how to best help grieving individuals. And then the last is cultural proficiency, the person or the organization will hold culture in high esteem by implementing changes in the way you individually address the cultural needs of the grieving person you're working with, or as an organization, improving services based on the cultural needs of the grieving individuals you're providing assistance to. Cultural sensitivity and cultural humility. So cultural competence is not something that has an endpoint, that we say, oh, I know what I need to know about a person's culture or the way the person grieves, and that's it. Rather, it is a never-ending and ever-expanding process. We have to continuously work as medical providers or future providers to explore how to best help people from different cultures. Cultural humility is an ongoing process of self-reflection to gain awareness of one's biases, and we would approach others with curiosity. Cultural sensitivity is an awareness and appreciation of the values, norms, and beliefs of other groups, and a willingness to adapt one's behavior accordingly. So the way we may deal or approach a particular person from another culture, we may need to adjust and adapt. Recognition of intersecting identities, that ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, education, all these things can affect the person's experience and impact the way how they grieve. So intersectionality can play a role in how persons grieve. And intersectionality is the concept that an individual's identity consists of multiple intersecting factors, as you can see in the diagram, included but not limited to gender identity, gender expression, race, ethnicity, class, past and present, religious beliefs, sexual identity, and sexual expressions. All these things can affect an individual's grieving experience and the impact death has on them. So we need to be sensitive to all these things when working with individuals who are grieving.
So culture plays a big role in how individuals grieve and, how they might be expected to grieve. So it could be from traditions for mourning to how the loss is internalized, who's responsible for coping, how they're coping, and also like their appropriate support systems. So some, traditions for mourning could be the perception of a burial or cremation, funeral, memorial services. What is the acceptable length of time, for grieving? And I think someone did mention that in the chat. Allowable expressions of grief is one, expected to cry, or are they expected to be happy? The use of customs and rituals, how the loss is internalized. So feelings of anger, guilt, anxiety, shock, loneliness, sadness, yearning. There could also be physical sensation of how they're internalizing it. So they could feel tightness in their chest, insomnia, fatigue, loss of appetite. There's also thoughts of disbelief, confusion, preoccupation, forgetfulness. And then there's behavior. So you could socially withdraw and also, have dreams. Who's responsible for coping? So, this could be the individual, nuclear family, extended family, friends, co-workers. I know in some communities, it's the entire neighborhood and like the entire community is grieving with the individual. Different coping styles could be, dignified and quiet, open display of emotions, such as like crying out loud, visiting and placing flowers at the burial sites, carrying mementos of the deceased. And then there's appropriate sources of support. Who is someone really going to reach out to? So it could be talking with a loved one, enjoying time with their friends and family, and also grief support groups.
So the US also has its own culture and norms surrounding grief that may not be true for other countries. So just starting with this quote that's from the Institute of Medicine, it says the mourning process in America, and specifically the United States today, is supposed to be brief and private. And so some reasons for that is that the US is an individualistic and heterogeneous society. And what I mean by that is that we have a culture or this ideology of picking yourself up by the bootstraps or reaching individual goals alone, and heterogeneous in terms of it being a diverse society. So many live far from their extended families. There's been a decline in religiosity. Grief is no longer shared and ritualized by the community in the way that it may have been in pre-industrial times, or in people who live in very close-knit communities where it's not common to move far from family. And also there is an assumption of linear stages of grief often. So in this image, you can see this model that was very popular for a long time, in which there are these linear stages of grief. And the expectation is that you would go through one stage, then move on to the next, and then to the next. And then under it, you can see how in reality, all these stages can happen in all types of different orders or all at once, or some people might not even experience some of these stages. And so I think, at this point, we all know that everyone experiences grief in different ways. But this model was very popular, and some people still have this assumption, and that can lead to a lot of confusion or even isolation if you think that this is what grief will be like, and then when you experience grief, it actually ends up being different. And so another aspect of the culture around grief in the US is that death and grief are concealed. So death often takes place in hospitals or nursing homes, and bodies are removed and taken care of by professionals. Wakes take place in funeral homes. So all of this goes to show of how this usually takes place outside of the home, or includes like third party or professionals outside of the family. And public displays of grief and conversations about death are taboo in US cultures. So this can leave some people experiencing grief alone, and again, that feeling of isolation, or a lack of knowledge of what to do, because it's not everyone, especially US born individuals, not everyone lives in these close-knit communities where there's a very obvious ritual that everyone goes through when someone dies. And so another big aspect of this is the institutional or systemic component that influences grief. So here in this model, you can see Brofenbrumer's ecological model, and it's basically a representation of how different systems influence an individual's experience. So going from a microsystem of like your family or your peers to a macro system of laws or history or culture. So one of these would be hospitals. So as we had mentioned, most deaths in the US happen in hospitals. And so there's an institutional requirement about what happens right after the death, whether that be how the body is taken care of, or where the family is allowed to be in that moment. Another institution would be the workplace. So employers determine leave policies, and this implies the appropriate amount of time after which a person should be able to function at work. And so that can also be confusing if you internalize that and believe, okay, at this point I should be functioning at work and I can't. That can be confusing or lead to guilt. And then another aspect we touched on earlier was the DSM. So it indicates at what point grief is considered abnormal or labeled as an illness or a disorder. And so with that also comes the implication that there is some kind of normal grieving process, which, as we've kind of covered today, it looks different for everyone and it is influenced by culture.
So as we mentioned, the way individuals grieve vary across cultures, various cultures and religions. And as Nicole mentioned earlier, we are not able to cover all cultures and religions, but we will discuss a few. Displays of grief in Puerto Rico, for example, bereaved women are expected to express their sorrow dramatically through displays of seizure-like attacks and uncontrollable emotions. And in various Southeast Asian American groups, they participate in public displays of wailing an open expression of sad emotion, but in private, they're expected to keep emotions contained to demonstrate strength in the face of life's tragedies. In the Igbo culture, which I'm very familiar with, when a person is grieving, it's when they celebrate as a form of recognizing the person's transition to a new world. So it's more of a celebration than a very mellow occasion. There are often 2 funerals or memorial services, which are quite lavish and include celebrations which can last days to weeks and may be months apart. These celebrations are necessary so that the person that died is respected and with their ancestors in the world of the living dead. We're going to discuss some examples of grief across various religious traditions. In the Hindu religion, for example, there's a belief when the person dies in reincarnation, and there's a preparation and cremation that occurs quickly, where the ashes are dispersed in one of India's holy rivers. In Judaism, Orthodox, the bodies are wrapped, placed in a wooden coffin, and there's usually a quick burial and service. The family and friends gather at home of the deceased to, as they call it, sit shiva. In the Muslim religion, the service and the burial often occur quickly as well. There's a lot of community involvement. The person is buried without a casket and positioned on the right side, facing Mecca in South Arabia. And in the Catholic religion, there are 3 parts to a funeral. There's the wake, where there are the prayers and eulogy offered by family and friends. The second part is a mass with prayers, Bible readings, liturgy, communion, and a concluding rite. And the third part is a burial with a blessing of the grave, a liturgy, and a communion, and a concluding rite. So these are just some of the religious traditions and cultural ways that people grieve that we should be very mindful of. The length of mourning is also a factor that needs to be considered across cultures. In the African culture, individuals mourn for a year, signified by the wearing of Black or navy clothing during that period. In the Chinese culture, the family is often in a state of sadness for 100 days after the burial, and a piece of colored cloth is worn on the sleeve of each family member, which indicates their sadness. Black is also worn by the deceased children, blue by grandchildren, and green by great-grandchildren.
So what's the role of clinicians and mental health providers? So I think, honoring the client's cultural understanding of death is really important. So we need to be, all of us need to do our own research and assessment to gain a deeper understanding of the individual's culture and intersecting identities and what death could mean to them. Just because they're from a certain, nationality or religion, it doesn't mean that they necessarily follow those culture, traditions, or religious practices. And also the interpretation of death and the beliefs and practices surrounding are very subjective. So it's important to always ask appropriate and culturally competent, sensitive questions to talk to someone of that same culture or you could also just talk to someone of the same culture to understand, the customs and the mourning practices that you might not understand. So you could get a clearer picture or understanding of how that individual is grieving. And then a second part that, as clinicians or future mental health providers, or even, just someone who's trying to help a friend out or someone who might be grieving, is to consider what is, your own culture and the experiences you've had with loss and how cultures influence the grieving process, reactions, responses, but also consider your biases with the cultural groups you might not be familiar with. And then understanding intersectionality of culture and as mentioned before, but also allow the client to self-identify their own cultural groups and don't make any assumptions. So for example, like just because I'm wearing a hijab or something over my head, it doesn't necessarily mean I'm Muslim, rather just could be that I'm wearing it for other reasons. So it's important to, make sure you know what the client or the person you're talking to really identifies as. Some self-reflection questions which might be like important to consider would be like, which parts of my identity am I aware of, which are most salient. So just think back to the picture of the intersectional identity that Angela presented on earlier. Which part of identities are privileged or marginalized? How does my sense of identity shift based on the context and setting, and what might be my own blind spots and biases?
So since Momona just highlighted how important self-reflection is for all of us, whether you are a counseling professional or just, someone out in the world who talks to other people and has social relationships, we thought that we would also give you an opportunity here to self-reflect. So anyone who is comfortable sharing in the chat, you're welcome to. Thinking about kind of those questions that Momona just mentioned, which parts of your identity are most salient to you and how they might shift based on context or settings, or maybe as you were going through this presentation, some blind spots or biases you might have noticed, but also how might, besides that, or taking that a step forward, how might that also be relevant for you, whether you are a practitioner, a clinician, or just someone who's supporting someone else who is experiencing grief. So does anyone have any thoughts that they want to add into the chat at this point as they're reflecting how this presentation might apply to them? Yeah, so someone said seeking counseling yourself, it's okay to go to therapy while also providing therapy. And I think that even transitions into our next point about self-care, that supporting someone who's experiencing grief can also be very overwhelming or can get stressful. And so you can't take care of others if you're not taking care of yourself and meeting your own needs as well. So I'm really glad that someone mentioned that point. Someone said, the isolation in American with grief really stood out to me because the prolonged grief diagnosis makes more sense. Yeah. I noticed my cultural limitations, how it evolved over time, rituals and meaning, making activities and awareness have been diluted. I see so much value in the practices and ways of expression in other cultural contexts. Cool. See. I learned so much I don't know about how people in other cultures experience grief and will make it a point to do my own research when interacting with clients. Yeah, so what's really nice about these comments is that it's a mix of people self-reflecting on themselves and their own experiences and their own cultures, as well as acknowledging that they don't know a lot about some other cultures and that they're willing to learn, and that it might be different for other cultures, which really is starting that process of cultural competency. Yeah, I'm seeing that people go to different sources of support based on their culture. Some comments about self-care, continued learning. It's so important for professionals to recognize that it is okay to not know versus assume. Yeah, I think that's a really great point that touches on our discussion about cultural humility and sensitivity, that there is no endpoint of cultural competence, but that it's important to be open and curious and want to know more about other people. Great. Yeah, thank you so much for providing your feedback on this. So lastly, what we wanted to do is give you all a chance to apply all of what we've been talking about today to a specific example. So I'm going to read this example of an individual who's experiencing grief, and feel free to also just write in the chat how you might think that culture is influencing this person's experience with grief, or just any ways that anything that we've talked about today might apply to this person's experience, or what you might include in a conversation with him, whether you're a counselor or a friend, anything. So Jose is a 17-year-old Mexican-American male, and he lost his father to a sudden aneurysm 4 months ago. Now Jose is the only male in his household, which includes his mother, maternal grandmother, and 2 younger sisters. His family is also impacted by the loss of his father's income. Although he had always been a strong student, Jose now struggles to concentrate in school and complete assignments. His grades are declining, and he is spending more time away from home with his friends. He experiences guilt and anxiety about his family's changing expectations of him. He believes that admitting these emotions make him weak and less of a man. So I'm going to give you all a few minutes to just consider how Jose's culture might be influencing his experience of grief, or how it might look different than from people who are not from his culture. Yeah, so I'm seeing some comments that are highlighting the loss of income, especially with the expectations of him as a male. Someone even mentioned machismo and how that might be affecting him. Intersectionality of ethnicity, gender expectations, and socioeconomic status. Someone said, I would ask Jose about those expectations as a male from his culture. Which already is a great start, just not assuming, but asking him for himself how he experiences that. What else? Someone said family counseling, so recognizing how family values might be very important. Being the breadwinner, lost the only other male he lived with. Yeah, and people are also talking about how all those additional pressures are kind of compounding onto that experience of grief. Are there other family members in his culture who have had the same experience that he can talk to? Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, so I think that you all highlighted some of the really important points. I just wanted to re-emphasize, right, how part of this vignette was also that he has feelings of guilt. And so that also might be part of his grief experience, that if he's feeling guilt, if he thinks that he's not meeting his family's expectations now that he is left as the only male in his family. Also the point about not being or being seen as a weak. So males must not show weakness or cry. And so depending on what context this is in, like if he is a client in a therapy session, that might also be an additional struggle for him, being in a setting where open emotional expression is expected as part of the process. So being able to acknowledge that. But yeah, I really appreciate all of the comments that you included here, and different ways that you would support him. It makes me feel really good that we have so many knowledgeable people that are so ready to support people experiencing grief from all different cultures.
So at this point, we would like you, we've come to the end of the presentation. We would like you to complete this survey, which will take less than 5 minutes and is completely anonymous. And if you can complete that, we would appreciate.
Yeah, if you're able, team, if you could put the link in the chat as well for folks who may not have their phones handy, that would be appreciated. And if it's all right with you, since we do have some time, if there's any questions that people might want to put in the chat or use the Q&A function, now would probably be a good time for that as folks fill out the survey.
So I just added that link to the survey in the chat as well for everyone to have access to.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, so for the person asking about resources, actually right after this page, we're just going to leave it up for anyone that needs to scan, but we'll move on to the next page after, which includes lots of different resources that you can use after this. And we'll also be sharing these slides with you as well.
I see a question I can answer in there. Yes, you will receive a certificate of attendance. You should be getting an email from me tomorrow if I time it correctly, and then we will get this recording up on YouTube next week.
So we'll give about 2 more minutes for the survey. Okay, so we wanted to say thank you so much for taking your time out to be here this afternoon. As was mentioned, we will share all the material and resources. They're attached at the end of the slide. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Mamona, Nicole, and RI. Our contact information is also on the last slide. So thank you so much for being here.
All right, so I see we've got a lot of people heading out before you go. Just wanted to make you aware of some upcoming webinars. You will also receive this in follow-up communication from myself and from Good Grief, but we are wrapping up our webinar season. So May 11th, we have a webinar on poetry and grief with poet and author Chanel Brenner. June 8th, we have Dr. Nina Verma, who's going to work with us on grief journaling. And also we have opened up our RFP process, our request for proposals for next year. So if you're sitting here going, this was great, and I also have something to share, we'd like to hear about it. We'd love to potentially partner with you. So thank you again, everyone, for your time and for your attention. Good Grief has tons of free resources online. Please feel free to check us out. All of our previous webinars are also on YouTube. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to me. that I'm Evelyn with 2 N's at good-grief.org. Great, I'm gonna